Good morning once again. Wayne's already said. See everybody in Sunday school today. Beautiful day on the outside. Okay, Mark chapter 6, verse 30. That's what we'll take up today. Mark chapter 6, verse 30. Here in just a minute when we get started back today in our lesson. Mark chapter 6, verse 30. But just to recap what we talked about last week, of course, we continued looking at the unbelief of Jesus' acquaintances, the folks there in Nazareth, the probably people he grew up with. That's what we continued looking at that last week. Verse number 3, not only did they not believe, but the last part of verse number 3 there says they were offended at him, or they stumbled over him. We looked at the verse in Peter where it talked about Jesus was a stone of stumbling to the unbelievers, and that was the case here with these people here at Nazareth because they didn't believe. Verse 4 and 5, their unbelief actually hindered Jesus' ministry because it said he wasn't able to do a lot of miracles, just a few things, lay his hands on a few sick folk and heal them, verse 4 and 5. Verse number 6, we see where the Bible says here that Jesus marveled, or he wondered because of their unbelief. And, there's one other place we talked about where the Bible talks about Jesus marveling, and that was with the story of the Roman centurion when he healed his servant there. And then we started looking at the unbelief of Jesus' enemies. And remember, this particular section we're looking at unbelief of his acquaintances. We looked at the unbelief also of his enemies last week, verses 7 through 9. We see where Jesus paired the apostles up 2 by 2 and sent them out and gave them special powers and told them what to take on their journey. Just a minimal amount of things he told them to take. Didn't want them to be loaded down with a bunch of baggage while they were doing the Lord's work there. In verses 10 and 11, he told them up front that some would believe and some would not. Again, we're talking about the unbelief of Jesus' enemies. And he told them that those that didn't believe, he gave them the authority to pass judgment on those cities and on those towns and on those people. Verses 12 and 13, we see where they went out and they preached repentance, they healed the sick, and they cast out devils, just as Jesus had commanded them to do. And then in verses 14 through 16, we started talking about where word got back to Herod. This was Herod Antipas here, about Jesus. And he thought that John the Baptist had came back from the dead to haunt him because he had a guilty conscience because of what he had done to John, how he had him arrested and unjustly executed. In verses 17 through 29, we're just a flashback to tell the story of what Herod did to John, and the story of John the Baptist, Herod, and Herodias. And then we looked at that, and verses 17 through 18, we saw where Herod had John arrested because Herodias wanted it so, because he had told him that it wasn't lawful for him to have his brother Philip's wife. So she didn't like that. Herod didn't like that, so they had him arrested, put him into prison. Verses 19 through 20, we see actually verse 19 where Herodias, she hated John the Baptist, said she had a quarrel against him. We talked about that was revenge. She hated him so much that she wanted revenge on him. We also saw in verse number 20, though, on the flip side, Herod actually liked John and said that he received him gladly. So he liked him. Herodias hated him. Verses 20 and 21, of course, we know at Herod's birthday party, Herodias came in and danced for him and all the people there. And it pleased him so much, verses 23 through 25, that he gave her request. Remember, he said, you can have anything up to half my kingdom. Of course, she chose the head of John the Baptist. She wanted John the Baptist dead. Well, her mother did. So that was the request. Verse 26, we see it saddened Herod because, again, he liked John. He didn't want to have to do this. But in verses 27 through 28, in order for him to save face, because he had made this oath in front of Herodias, his daughter, in front of all these people. Remember, there were a lot of very important people there at his party, so he had made this oath, and to save face, he had to go through with it. So he had John executed. We know the story, had his head brought in on charge. He gave it to the daughter, and she gave it to Herodias, and that culminated Herodias' evil plan to try to get John the Baptist executed, and she did. Verse 29, of course, we saw where John's disciples came and got his body and they were allowed to bury it, and they went and told Jesus about it later. Mark doesn't record this part, but they told Jesus about it, and he was grieved as well. And we talked about, as we finished up, how this Herod Antipas, he actually saw Jesus one more time at his trial, and he wanted to see some great miracles, but Jesus would not even speak to him because of all the things that he had done. And we saw later where he was actually exiled, Herod Antipas was, because he had stirred an uproar against the Roman government. And so we looked at that, and that's how we finished up last week. So we'll start here, and again, chapter 6, verse 30, and now in this particular section, actually verses 30 through 56, we're going to see the unbelief of the disciples. Again, we talked about the unbelief of Jesus' acquaintances, his enemies, and now we're going to look at the unbelief again of the disciples in a couple instances here, a couple stories, a couple events that take place in these verses. But I just want to start by reading first just verses 30 through 33, and then we'll get into these other two events, the feeding of the 5,000 and the calming of the sea again here in just a minute. But Mark 6, verse number 30, and the apostles gathered themselves together unto Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And he said unto them, Come ye yourselves apart into a desert place and rest for a while. For there were many coming and going, and they had no leisure so much as to eat. And they departed into a desert place by ship privately. And the people saw them departing, and many knew him, and ran afoot thither out of all the cities, and outwent them, and came together unto him. So here, verse number 30 here, we see where the apostles came back after, remember, they had been on their missionary journey, if you will, and they were ministering, they were preaching, they were healing the sick, they were casting out devils, and they were excited about all that they were able to do. So they came back here, verse number 30, and they told Jesus what had happened. They reported it back here to Jesus, says both what they had done and what they had taught. So they talked about all the miracles they'd done, but he also said about what they taught. Now you remember back in Luke chapter number 10, when the 70 when the 70 returned that Jesus had sent out, and that event happened a little bit after this particular time, because now here, remember, it was just the 12 apostles that he sent out, just 12 of them, paired them up 2 and 2. But in Luke chapter number 10, he sent 70 out 2 by 2. And when they came back, they were excited about what all that they had been able to do as well, and they reported that to Jesus. And we know the story there where Jesus said, it's great, that you were able to do all these miracles, and that's wonderful, but the main thing that you need to rejoice about is because you're saved. We know those scriptures. Let me read them to you here. Luke 10, verses 17 through 20. And the 70 returned again with joy, saying, Lord, even the devils are subject unto us through thy name. He said unto them, I beheld Satan as lightning falling from heaven. Behold, I give unto you power to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you. Notwithstanding in this rejoice not that the spirits are subject unto you, but rather rejoice because your names are written in heaven. So that's what Jesus had told the 70 when they came back. Now he doesn't tell these 12 apostles that when they come back here, and we don't know why he doesn't tell them that. It could be that maybe when they came back, they focused more on those that had been saved. Because remember, they preached repentance. They not only casted out devils and healed the sick, but they preached repentance too. So they may have brought more report back about that part of it than healing the sick and casting out devils. We don't know, just speculation there, but they did preach repentance. So here, verse number 30, they came back, they were excited about what they had done. But notice verse number 31, Jesus said, He said unto them, Come ye yourselves apart into a desert place and rest a while, for there were many coming and going, and they had no leisure, no, not so much as to eat. So Jesus tells them here, so you've been busy in the work of the Lord, you've been ministering, you've been doing a lot of work, a lot of good things. He said, but you need to rest. It's time for you to come apart, and time for you to rest, even though you've been busy doing the Lord's work. I read a quote this week by Vance Havner. A lot of you have heard about him, heard his name. This is what he had to say. He says, if you don't come apart and rest, you will come apart. And that's true. A lot of times people just get so busy in the Lord's work. Now again, this is just an opinion, my opinion, but I think people can get too busy sometimes in the Lord's work, because even Jesus here himself, the Son of God, God in the flesh, he had to take time at different times, we know, to rest and to have fellowship with his friends and to find and to have fellowship or communion with his Father. So he had, even Jesus, God in the flesh, had to do that. Now, granted, of course, most of us don't fall into that category of being too busy in the Lord's Word. Just be honest with you. I can't say that I fall into that category. But we've all seen people. You all know, somebody's probably came to your mind already that maybe at some point they just got so busy in the Lord's work, they just overextended themselves. And therefore, they just maybe weren't good for what they needed to be. And, so again, we need to be careful not to get so busy that we forget about other things that are important. Yeah, God's work is important, very important, but there's other things that are important too. So that's what Jesus here, he's telling these apostles, they've been busy, and he says you need to come apart and you need to rest just for a little while. So verse number 32 here, it said they tried. It says they departed into a desert place by ship privately, so they were going to try to get some rest like Jesus had commanded, like he had told them to do. But then we see verse 33 here, these overzealous crowds again, they continue to follow Jesus, and they continue to follow the disciples. Verse 33, and the people saw them departing, and many knew him, and ran afoot thither out of all the cities, and outwent them, and came together unto him. So even though they tried to get away and get some rest, these people, these crowds, they still kept following Jesus because they wanted help from him. He had healed all these people, and he had cast out all these devils. So they wanted Jesus to help them too. And it's good to see here that no matter how tired Jesus was, though, he always took time, to help these people when they would come to him. So he was busy doing his Father's work, but he also took time to help these people in time of need when they would come to him. If anybody had a need, they would come to him, and he was always ready to help them. So we see here where the apostles came back excited about what they'd been doing, reported their work to Jesus, and he says, well, let's try to see if we can get a little rest. But as we see, that didn't work out exactly probably like he was hoping it would. But now Mark records here two miracles. And again, we're talking about this particular section, the disciples' unbelief. And we're going to see some unbelief of the disciples in these next two events that happen. The first one that Mark records, of course, here's the feeding of the 5,000, verses 34 through 44. And then later, the calming of the storm again. We've already had one story where he calmed the storm, but this is a second one. Verses 45 through 56. So let's look at the first one here, the feeding the 5,000. Let me read verses 34 through 44, and then just look at some of these verses here and kind of see where the disciples had a little bit of unbelief here in this particular event. So Mark 6, verse 34, and Jesus, when he came out, saw much people and was moved with compassion toward them, because they were as sheep not having a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. And when the day was now far spent, his disciples came unto him and said, this is a desert place, and now the time is far past. Send them away, that they may go into the country round about, and into the villages, and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. And he answered and said unto them, give ye them to eat. And they say unto him, shall we go and buy 200 penny worth of bread, and give them to eat? And he saith unto them, how many loaves have ye? Go and see. And when they knew, they say, 5 and 2 fishes. And he commanded them to make all sit down by companies upon the green grass, and they sat down in ranks by hundreds and by 50s. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, he looked up to heaven and blessed and brake the loaves and gave unto his disciples to set before them, and the 2 fishes divided he among them all. And they did all eat and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fishes, and they that did eat of the loaves were about 5,000 men. So this very familiar story. We all know it. We've all heard it through the years. The feeding here of the 5,000. Another story, feeding of the 4,000. But this is the 5,000 here that he fed. And again, verse number 34, already mentioned, as always, when Jesus would see people in need, he had compassion on these people. And he took it as an opportunity to minister to these crowds, where the disciples, as we'll see here in a minute, we've already read the verses, they may have looked on this crowd as more of a nuisance. But Jesus said, no, I'm going to have compassion. It's an opportunity for me to witness. See what he said? He said Jesus saw them as sheep not having a shepherd. So he became their shepherd, and he began to teach them. Last part of verse number 34 says, and he began to teach them many things. So he had compassion on him. We know a very familiar verse in Jude verse 22. And if some have compassion, making a difference. And of course we know Jesus made all the difference in the world, didn't he, by the compassion he had. Well, we too today, if we have compassion, we can make a difference as well. Let me read you just one little paragraph here about D.L. Moody, about the compassion that D.L. Moody had. It said, when D.L. Moody was building his great Sunday school in Chicago, children came to him from everywhere. They often passed by other churches and Sunday schools to be with Mr. Moody. When asked why he walked so far to attend Moody's Sunday school, one boy replied, because they love a fellow over there. So the children could even tell the difference. Right. So everybody can tell the difference. Children, men, women, it doesn't matter. People can tell the difference when we have compassion and we have that love in our hearts, like Jesus did, like D.L. Moody did, like other people. We all know somebody, I'm sure. When you think about them, they just always have compassion. So Jesus here he did, verse 34. And we know everywhere he went, he had compassion on the people. But let's look at verse 35 and 36. Let's see the disciples' first suggestion here for the problem. Verse 35, and when the day was now far spent, his disciples came unto him and said, this is a desert place, and now the time is far spent, send them away, that they may go into the country round about into the villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. So the first suggestion the disciples had here, he says, just send them away. Let them find their own food. It's been a long day. We're all tired. We're in this desert, and we don't have any food. He said, so the disciples here, these apostles, they said, just let them fend for themselves. Remember a while ago I said the disciples may have considered the crowd more of a nuisance than an opportunity to minister, like Jesus did. So they said that was the disciples' first suggestion. Just send them away. Let them fend for themselves. But let's see Jesus' response here in the first part of verse number 37. But he says, he answered and said unto them, give ye them to eat. So he says, no. He says, I want you to feed them. He says, so you guys are apostles. He says you're leaders. He says it's your job to help these people and have compassion on them like I want to have compassion on them. They came to us for help. So we need to try to help them. So we need to keep that in mind today. If people come to us for help, and we have the means to help them, we need to try to help them and not consider them a nuisance, but an opportunity to minister. So the last part of verse 37, though, we see the second suggestion of the disciples here. And they say unto him, shall we go and buy 200 penny worth of bread and give them to eat? So their suggestion was, well, I guess we could try to raise enough money here to try to buy enough food to try to feed this big crowd. Of course, that option was a whole lot better than the first one, right? Because the first one didn't help them at all. It said, just send them away, fend for yourself, find your own food. So they said, well, maybe we can raise enough money here to try to buy them some food. But the disciples were even skeptical about buying food. Remember what Philip said in John chapter 6, verse number 7? Philip answered him, 200 penny worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one may take a little. So even Philip there, one of the apostles, he says, even if we had 200 penny worth to go buy bread, he said, what is that? That's not even going to be enough for them to eat. So again, we're talking about the unbelief of the disciples here. So it sounds like these apostles here and these disciples would make a good committee, wouldn't it? Somebody defined a committee this way. I read this week and I thought it was interesting. A committee is a group of people who can individually do nothing and collectively decide that nothing can be done. That sounds like most committees you see today, right? I've been in some of those. I don't know if you call them committees, but you know how it is today. And in the age we live in today, it's all about teams, right? And I'm sorry, that just drives me crazy. If I've got a job to do, I want to do it myself. I want to get it taken care of and get it done. Because you seldom ever can get anything done if you do it as a team or a committee. I'm sure all of y'all have been there too. Steve's laughing. I know he's been there. He works with me at Mohawk, so I know he knows what I'm talking about. So these apostles here, they would have made good committee members because they didn't think, well, we can't do it individually, and even as a group, I don't think we can do it. Even this money we might could get is not even going to be enough. Because now you have to remember, though, 200 pennyworth, back then that was quite a bit of money.
Yes, sir.
It was the equivalent of a year's wages for the average laborer. Yeah. So that was a lot of money. So they said, we can't even raise this money. And even if we did, it's not going to be enough to feed these people. So there's no way we can come up with this kind of money. So again, now remember, we're still talking about the disciples' unbelief here. And one thing they forgot, that they were looking at man's resources, yes, and not God's resources. Right. That they were looking at it, the wrong way, the wrong aspect. They were looking at, well, we can't do it, and they were forgetting. They had already forgot all this stuff that Jesus had done. Their memories were so short. Right. All these miracles he had already performed, and Jesus, he was God in the flesh. He could do anything. He could whatever he wanted to do, but they had already forgot about that. They just lacked faith there a little bit. So let's go on here. Verse 38, we see what Jesus said. And he saith unto them, how many loaves have ye? Go and see. And when they knew, they say, 5 and 2 fishes. So he said, okay, he said, how much food do we have right now? Go and find out. What do we have right now that we could use? And of course, we know that it was Andrew, remember, who found the lad. John chapter 6, verse 8 and 9, and one of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, saith unto him, there is a lad here, which hath 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes, but what are they among so many? So again, even Andrew here, Philip said, if we had this money, it's not going to be enough. And Andrew says, we've got these 5 loaves and 2 fishes, but what is that among so many? So again, forgot about, they had Jesus there, God in the flesh, with them, so more unbeliefs. But Jesus, I can imagine Jesus probably thought, well, that's exactly enough. That's exactly what we need to be able to feed all these people. 5 barley loaves and 2 fishes. So let's see what happens here next. Verse 39 and verse number 40. And he commanded them to make all sit down by companies upon the green grass, and they sat down in ranks by hundreds and by 50. So Jesus had the people here. He said he had this big crowd to sit down in organized groups. Now, this was not just some chaotic scene. All these people were hungry, but it wasn't just chaotic where they were all just running to Jesus to try to, grab something to eat and get a piece of that bread and get a piece of that fish. It was not chaotic. It was very, very organized, because he said here he had them to sit down in companies on the green grass by ranks of hundreds and by 50s. And so, just a side note, I love being organized. Everybody that knows me, I guess, knows that. I'm an extremely organized person, probably too much, I guess, but nothing's wrong with organization. Jesus had them to do it here, right? So I'm just following Jesus' example here, trying to be organized. He said, have them to sit down, organized groups, so this won't be so chaotic here when we can get this done. All right, verse number 41, the first part of verse number 41. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, he looked up to heaven and blessed and brake the loaves and gave them to the disciples. So we see here Jesus, he took the food, he blessed the food, and he broke the food. So this is what Jesus did. The Bible tells us here in this verse. And of course we know it's always the right thing to say the blessing over our food, say grace, whatever word, say a prayer, whatever you want to call it. We always need to do that. We've always tried to do it. That's just all I've ever known, and I'm sure all of y'all do the same thing. Whether it be out loud. Now, you don't have to. Some people may take it to an extreme when they're in a restaurant, maybe just so they can be seen. That's not the right reason to do it. You need to do it because you're thankful for what you have to eat. Whether you do it out loud, whether you do it silently, it doesn't really matter. Just as long as you thank the Lord for what you're about to eat. And a good example here Jesus gives us. Don't ever be ashamed to do that, no matter where you are. Last part of verse number 41, we see here, he says, and he gave them to his disciples and set before them, and the two fishes were divided among them all. So Jesus gave it here to the disciples so they could distribute it. Now, it's very important here, though, in these verses, we need to remember that the miracle took place in Jesus' hands, not the disciples' hands. The other disciples are the ones, they found the food, the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes. They found the lad that had it. They brought the food to Jesus, but Jesus is the one that performed the miracle, not the disciples. So Jesus was able to bless it. He was able to multiply it. So I read something else this week that I thought was interesting. A good comparison says we are not the manufacturers. We're just the distributors.
Right.
Just like Jesus and the disciples here. Jesus was the manufacturer, right? But the disciples were just the distributors. They were to give it out. And we know how that works today in business. You know, you have your manufacturing facilities where that's where everything's produced. That's where everything's made. But then you have your distribution facilities as well. And that's where what's been made, the product's been made, is taken to those places. And then from there, it's distributed. Right. And from there, it's given out. So that's the same way it works with us today. You know, we don't make it. We don't manufacture the Word of God, but it's our duty to distribute it, right, and to give it out. Right. And so it's a good example here that we have here with this story. We need to apply it to our lives as well. Verse number 42 says, and they did all eat and were filled. So notice it says all. So that means everybody, right? Everybody was at this crowd. They ate, but it also says they were filled. I mean, nobody went away hungry. Everybody that was there got enough to eat, and they were filled as well. Verse 43, and they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and the fishes. So there was 12 baskets of leftovers. So that just shows us that God supplies more than we need. Right. Not just what we need, because it says all ate, all were filled, and there were still some stuff left over, some leftovers, 12 baskets full. Now initially, we don't know how big a basket this lunch initially took up. Could have been the same baskets. We don't know. So the lunch came in as one, right? And 5,000, more than 5,000 were fed and filled, and yet there were still 12 baskets full left over. What a miracle this was. Verse 44, and they that did eat of the loaves were about 5,000 men. Now, Mark doesn't say it, but Matthew, remember, he tells us that there were 5,000 men, not including women and children. Matthew 14, verse 21. This is the same story here. Matthew records it. And they that had eaten were about 5,000 men, beside women and children. So you'd have to think a very, very conservative estimate would be 10,000 people. Right. I mean, wouldn't you think? If there were 5,000 men, assuming half of them were married, it would be 7,500. Assuming that those that were married had just one child, that's another 2,500, right? So that's 10,000 right there. A very, very conservative estimate would be 10,000 people here were fed. You know, most of the time we say 5,000, but no, there was probably at least 10,000 people here were fed. So what an amazing miracle this was. I don't think we fully appreciate the magnitude of this. Even if it had been 5,000, I mean, that's a great miracle in itself, but there was probably twice that many that were fed. They were filled. 12 basketfuls of leftovers were taken up, and it all started with just 5 loaves and 2 small fishes, as one of the writers record that it was 2 small fishes as well. So again, that's the story here of the feeding of the 5,000 plus. And we saw some of the disciples' unbelief in this story, did we not? And that's what we're talking about, the unbelief of the disciples. Well, Mark records the second miracle here. Well, we'll also see some unbelief of the disciples, and that's the stilling of the water. And let's read that particular story, beginning in verse number 45 here. Mark chapter 6, verse 45. I'll read this. I'll read down through verse 52, I guess. Mark 6, verse 45, and straightway he constrained his disciples to get into the ship and to go to the other side before into Bethsaida, while he sent away the people. And when he had sent them away, he departed into a mountain to pray. And when even was come, the ship was in the midst of the sea, and he alone on the land. And he saw them toiling and rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them. And about the 4th watch of the night he cometh unto them, walking upon the sea, and would have passed by them. But when they saw him walking upon the sea, they supposed it had been a spirit, and cried out. For they all saw him and were troubled. And immediately he talked with them, and saith unto them, Be of good courage, it is I, be not afraid. And he went up unto them, into the ship, and the wind ceased. And they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure, and wondered, for they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. So we see here the story Mark records here about the stealing of the sea. Again, we already had the story once before back in chapter number 5, but now here verse number 45 he starts talking about another incident. And straightway, we see in verse 45, it starts out, and straightway, that's one of Mark's favorite words again, remember, straightway, immediately. I mean, after this great miracle here with the feeding of the 5,000 plus, no time to stop, they had to keep going. Straightway, immediately, he constrained them to get in the ship and to go across the Sea of Galilee. Once again, this time they were going to the city of Bethsaida. So again, there was more work to be done at Bethsaida. Great works had been done now, but they had to leave and go across the sea to continue their work. Verse 46 and 47, though. We read those again. And when he had sent them away, he departed into a mountain to pray. And when the evening was come, the ship was in the midst of the sea, and he was alone on the land. So notice this time, Jesus didn't go with them. Remember back in chapter number 5 during the storm, Jesus went with them. Remember, he was asleep in the hinder part of the ship on a pillow. So he was with them. But this time, he went to a mountain to pray. So he knew he needed to be praying for him. So I guess he was probably teaching them this time to live by faith. Even though Jesus wasn't physically with them on the ship this time, he knew that he could and would come to their rescue when they needed it, just like he had done in the past. So again, Jesus was not with them here this particular time. Verse number 48, first part of 48. And he saw them toiling and rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them. So again, not unusual for a storm to come up on the Sea of Galilee. Because of the location, it happened all the time. So another storm came up, and they were right in the middle of it. Another bad storm, apparently, because it says they were toiling and rowing. So they were doing all they could. They were working as hard as they could to try to get that ship to land, to get it to the other side because of this great ship that had come up, try to keep the ship afloat. I'm sure the waves were probably high, water coming in the boat. So they were doing everything they could to try to keep it afloat. Look at the last part of verse number 48. About the fourth watch of the night, he cometh unto them, walking upon the sea, and would have passed by. So we see Jesus here. He saw what was going on, so he came walking on the sea to them. And it says he walked close, but would have passed by. Well, why did he act maybe as if he was just going to keep going and not stop? Well, probably because Jesus wanted the disciples to recognize him. Right. I mean, he knew who they were. He knew what situation they were in, but he wanted them to recognize him and trust him and to invite him into the ship. So that's probably why he appeared as he was going to go on by. Well, verse number 49, but when they saw him walking upon the sea, they supposed it had been a spirit, and cried out. They didn't recognize him. They thought it was a ghost walking on the sea. So they cried out in fear. Again, here we're talking about fear, lack of faith, unbelief. We're still talking about the unbelief here of the disciples. They didn't even recognize that it was Jesus. But nonetheless, look at verse number 50. We see what Jesus did. For all saw him and were troubled, and immediately he talked with them and saith unto them, Be of good cheer. It is I, be not afraid. So he reassured them with his words. Remember, we talked about that last week. It was the words of Jesus with Jairus' daughter. Well, the same thing here. It's Jesus' words. He says, Be of good cheer. It is I. He said, Don't be afraid. He said, I'm here to take care of you and to help you. Well, Mark doesn't record it here, but it was at this very point here where Peter actually walked on the water. Now, Matthew records that. Mark doesn't. Let me just read those verses real quick. Matthew 14, verses 28 through 31. And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it be thou, bid me come unto thee on the water. And he said, Come. And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him and said, O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? So again, even Peter here, his faith was weak, and he began to doubt and had that unbelief. Of course, we criticize Peter a lot, but we shouldn't. He's the only one that attempted to get out of the boat. You've heard that thousands of times. You know that, but it's true. He's the only one of all the disciples that even attempted to get out of the boat. Now, again, Mark does not record the story here of Peter walking on the water. Not really sure why. It could be that, remember, when we first started our lesson in Mark, Mark was actually Peter's spokesperson a lot of the times, and he was like maybe Peter's apprentice, I guess, if you will. And some of the events that Mark writes about, he very well may not even been present at those events. Peter may have later told him about them, so Mark wrote them down. So it could have been that when Peter was telling about this event and this thing that happened, maybe Peter didn't want to brag about being able to walk on the water, or he might have been embarrassed that it began to sink. So could be one or the other. We don't know, just speculation. But either way, he may not even mention this part to Mark when Mark was penning this down here for us. So just speculation, maybe why Mark didn't record the episode here where Peter actually walked on the water. We'll stop right here. Lord willing, we'll take up verse 51 and continue this event here where Jesus walks on the water. He calms the storm again for the disciples. And we'll, again, Lord willing, we'll take up here next week. Mark chapter 6, verse 51.